Hello and welcome to Samsung. In this video, I am going to talk about the radius configuration on the Samsung WLAN controller. Um, Before I do that, I'm going to give you an example of how the radius process works and where in the controller do we use, what are the different scenarios in which you use radius. All right, so let's get started. So what I have here is a basic authentication process where the station is authenticated on the controller via an external radius server. So as you can see, the station, sends the authentication request response and sends the association request. At that point, the controller is set for doing .1x authentication, and it sends it the EAP-OL, which is EAP over LAN start message, which is optional. At this point, the user enters the credentials, so it might be a username, password, and this setting is done at the station level. So if you're using any sort of EAP, whether if it's an EAP TLS or if it's PEEP. And again, my assumption is that whoever is looking at this video is familiar with all the different EAP methods. um, the user, that is all configured on the station. From the controller's perspective, when it comes to an external radius server, we are completely transparent and agnostic to the EAP message. The controller just turns around and takes the EAP message and uses formulates a radius message and sends EAP over radius. So that's how it works for us. But this flow diagram shows you how an external radius authentication actually works. So now the user enters the credentials. It comes to the controller. The controller generates EAP over radius messages, and there's a whole flow where there's a radius access request, and then there's an access challenge where the whole security mechanism takes place, and eventually if the credentials are given by the user are correct, an access accept is received at the controller, and then the four-way handshake happens where the keys are established for the session, and now you have an encrypted session and the user is authenticated properly. So that's how the basic radius mechanism works. This is in the case where you have an external radius configured. Now, most of the enterprises, they have an external radius server which may in turn talk to some sort of an active directory, um, where they store user profiles. The controller, as of right now, as of making of this video, does not have a direct integration with an active directory. So we don't have an LDAP interface. So if traditionally the way it is done is in large enterprises, you have the controller and that talks to an external radius server, which then has an interface to an AD of some sort. And the user database resides on the AD, and Radius can basically then have query the Active Directory for the LDAP credentials and whatnot. So, and that's how it works. But the controller itself does not have a direct interface to Active Directory. So, apart from this, the guest users. So, I have dedicated a video to Captive Portal. Now in Captive Portal also you can have a scenario where the Captive Portal itself, the web server itself resides on the controller, and the users enter their credentials, and the controller can then use those credentials and authenticate them against an external Radius server. So we support the guest user authentication against the Radius also, and that's used primarily where you have, again, you don't want to maintain the user database on the controller itself. You want to offload that to the to an external radius server like ICE. ICE, for instance, has a nice guest portal. So there is again, the lobby admins can create the account on that guest portal, and you can authenticate the guest users against that guest portal. So that's something that we support also. Now, apart from that, if you don't have a radius server but would still like to use, things like PEEP or .1x kind of authentication, we have an inbuilt radius server also. There are some limitations to it where we don't support inbuilt radius server. Does have some limitations though. You can do things like PEEP, and you can use inner protocols like MSTAP v2, but if it comes to like an EAP TLS, we don't support it on the internal radius server. But you can still do basic username password based authentication using that. But if it's like a EAP TLS where you require a certificate to be stored on the locally on the controller, and then you have a certificate on the client device, that's something that is not supported right now on the internal radius server. When it comes to the external radius server, all EAP methods are supported. We are agnostic to EAP, as I mentioned before. All right, so now that being said, let's move on to the controller, and we look at where in the controller you go in and configure the radius settings. Now, one of the other things that I have seen enterprises do is you can also use external radius to authenticate, or to do MAC based authentication. So station connects to an SSID using password based mechanism, and before you authenticate him, you basically send his MAC address to the radius server to make sure that he's an authorized or whitelisted MAC. And then once he gets an access accept from the radius server, we go ahead and accept that client. So that's also something that the controller supports. All right, so with that background, let's come to the controller and get to where the actual radius configuration is. So you're going to come into configuration, you're going to go into security in AAA. There is the radius setting right here, and you can see the AAA setting. So you can add a AAA server here, and you can select the type. So typically it's authentication and accounting. Specify the IP address of the radius server. The shared secret is something which has to be the same on the controller and the radius server. The port numbers, you have to verify what version of radius you are using. If you're using an older Cisco ACS, they tend to use 1600 port numbers, I believe 1617 or 1618. But 1812 and 1813 is the latest version of the IETF RFC that for radius. So they specify 1812 and 1813. So you may want to be very careful as to what port you are using. Um, and then these are the things where you are specifying how at what interval you are going to be retransmitting and things like that. Now, COA is change of authorization. This pertains to things like BYOD, and again, if you're using a high-end radio server like ICE, it has the capability to turn around and change the authorization after certain conditions are met for a particular station, and that means the instead of the client coming in and generating a radius message, the server turns around and sends a radius message to you, and it could be a disconnect message where you want to disconnect a station, and it sends a disconnect message, or it's another method is there is a change of authorization, or there is a re-authenticate message. So those are the reauthorized message. So I can show you, I have a COA disconnect message from a radius server, and this is taken from ICE, and you can see that it says the accounting termination causes admin reset. So it sends actually a disconnect message here. So MAC authentication is, as I mentioned just before, as I mentioned just before, we also support MAC filtering based on radius. So this is how the MAC is going to go towards the radius server. So you can either send it this way, you can either send it this way using a colon or a hyphen, whatever your radius server. So however you've configured the MAC address on the radius server, that's how we'll send it out. So, and then whether it should be uppercase, lowercase, all these things are important to keep in mind, because that's how it's gonna, like, some radius servers might be very sensitive to how they receive the information, like a username information, for instance. So now in that case we use PAP, we don't use EAP. When it comes to sending the radius based MAC authentication. So something to keep in mind. Now, that being said, this is how you would, first step is to come into security, AAA radius, and add the radius server. And then obviously the next step is you go into the WLAN itself and add the radius server there. So let's see if I can pick a WLAN which already has a radius server configured. So let's see. I have quite a lot of SSIDs here. Uh, let's pick one. So let's configure an SSID here with let's configure an SSID with 802.1x security. Now, one thing to keep in mind that in this when you're configuring radius based authentication, it has got no relationship whether it's a locally bridged SSID versus it's a tunneled SSID, because this all this is happening before you make the decision whether you want to tunnel the traffic back or you want to locally bridge. So this is at the time where station gets authenticated. Once the station is authenticated, then based on how the SSID is configured, the traffic either tunnels back to the controller, meaning that's the user traffic beginning from the first DHCP message that goes out from the station. So it goes to the access point, and then on the wire it goes either to the controller or the WAP locally switches or does an L2 switching on it. So your security settings have got no bearing on either whether it's a locally switched WLAN or it's a tunnel WLAN. So again, to configure 802.1x security, you have to come here, select WPA WPA2, and you can see auth key management. So the key management is either using a password or it comes, gets dynamically assigned. That PMK that we saw over here, that key came from the radius server. The controller generates that key, and then after that, the transient key is generated, which is used only for that session. Once that session goes away, the next set of keys are generated. So it's a very secure way of doing. It's a very secure way of doing encryption. So once that is done, you are going to select 802.1x. Now, if 802.1x is selected, and let's say if I say apply here, it's gonna tell me that you need to have radius servers configured. So radius authentication should be enabled for 802.1x. So the first thing I need to do, that means, is come to radius within the WLAN and select authentication server and accounting server. As you can see, I have three different options here. So I'll try the first radius server. If that fails, I try the second one, and if that fails, it basically does a round robin. And let's say you get to the third radius server and you are able to connect to it. At that point you send at regular intervals keep alive to the primary and secondary radius server. That way once the primary comes back up, the next set of messages can go to the primary radius server. Okay, so now once that is done, that is all you need. You configure the radius server here. So you can see there are two options. I can either do an internal radius server which resides within the controller, or I can do an external radius server which is external. Once that is done, you come here and you select that, hit apply, and you're good to go. And that's all the settings that are needed for the radius. Now, another thing is, let's say the security was guest, right? Because I said that even the guest users are authenticated against radius. So in that case, you have L3, which is, we'll select web authentication, for instance. So we say web authentication, and you can see the web authentication server type is local, or you can say radius here, and then you can specify the radius server. So here once the guest users put in their credentials, once you present them with a splash page, and the web page could be either internal, or you can, whatever we talked about this in the previous video. But once the users enter their credentials, the web authentication can either be done locally where the user database resides, or an external radius server also, like ICE. So that's something to keep in mind. Now that takes care of all the settings that we have for radius, except how do you do MAC based filtering? So to do MAC filtering using radius, you have to come to AAA, and then you have to go to MAC filter, and you have to create a MAC filter with, you have to name it whatever you want to name it, and you should deny the policy. You should say the policy is denied, and you're not going to do anything else. So you're going to come into the Mac. So step one is to come to the Mac filter, name the Mac filter, put the policy deny, apply, then come back. Now, if you want to do Mac filtering for a particular SSID on a particular SSID, which is password based, it can only be done on a PSK based on a PSK based SSID. So you're going to come back here. We're going to say security PSK, and you're going to say Mac filter test, and then you're going to go to okay, and then you're going to go here to the radius servers and enable the radius server again. So again, the steps to do MAC filtering based on radius, you have to go into the security and then create a MAC filtering policy, or the MAC filter policy will deny option. Come to the WLAN, apply the security setting, select the profile over there, and then specify the radius server. So that's how it is done for MAC based filtering. Alright, so that's all I have in this video. This takes care of, before I forget, there's one more thing. So for internal Radius server, you have to have an internal user database. So where does that database reside? That resides internally. So, that you can specify here. You can say triple security, AAA, the Radius users are right here, and you can either import the user list. So the easiest way to do it is create a username password. So let's say I create a password, and keep this in mind: the user ID cannot have these characters, the password cannot have these characters. Very restrictive that way. uh, and let's say I just say Samsung123, Samsung123, and I apply. And now I have this user ID created. I can import or I can export it here. And then if you have a long list of users that you want to create, you can basically add it right here, and then import that list directly here. So that ways, if you already have a list of IDs and passwords created, you can just add it to the list and import it right here, because that's something that you cannot be expected to, like, if you have like hundreds of users that you already have in place. You don't want to go ahead and enter that all at once. So all you can do is just use this Excel sheet, where this is the template of the Excel sheet. You can just copy and paste the username password. So here you go. It's very as simple as that. So there's a username and there's a password field, and you're gonna copy all the usernames in this column over here. You're gonna copy all the passwords here. You want to put in the name, department, and all that good information. That's good enough, and you import it right there. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, so that concludes our video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you.